welcome to She Investigates, the podcast where we investigate all things weird. I'm your host, Gwen Ross, and today we're exploring a strange and puzzling tale from the skies, the story of the Ghost Blimp. But first, let's catch up. First, I want to give a shout out to my sister. You may have noticed that our theme song was a little bit different this week. My amazingly talented sister, Shannon Rindlisbacher, came up with a little marimba line to add to my accordion theme song, and it just sounds wonderful. So thank you to Shannon. And then I also just wanted to say thank you to everyone who supported my first episode and listened to it. It's always a little bit scary to put yourself out there, and all of the nice messages that I got and texts were just so nice. So thank you for supporting me and listening to my first episode. I also wanted to talk this week about something that has been on my mind, and it's probably been on your mind too, because 'tis the season, it's January, and a lot of us are thinking about New Year's resolutions. Now, I don't know what it is, but every year in the week between Christmas and New Year's, I convince myself that I can become a completely different person when the clock strikes 12 on New Year's Eve. And I just make this huge list of all of the things that I want to change and do better and all of the goals that I have. And how many do I actually end up accomplishing by the end of the year? Usually 0. But I do it every year anyways. I don't know why. So I thought that it would be fun for me to share a couple of my New Year's resolutions for this year. Not all of them because, like I said, it's a lengthy list. But the first one on my list is to start some type of a collection. Now, what type of collection? I have no idea. But I just love when people love something enough to want to collect all of something. So my goal this year is to find something that I love enough that I want to have a huge collection of it. Fun fact, I used to have a comfy sock collection, but it kind of got out of control, so I had to get rid of it. But this year, I want to find something else to start a collection with. Number 2 on my list was start a podcast. So look at me go. It is January 15th, and I have already accomplished one of my New Year's resolutions for the year. So I guess there's that. I also put on here, learn a new skill. And then I put in parentheses, guitar, pickleball, cross stitch. I think what I'm going to pick up this year is pickleball. I want just a new hobby. And pickleball has kind of been on my radar for a while because it's gaining popularity and just looks like a fun sport to pick up. So I probably will do pickleball. I don't think that I'm quite old enough yet to become a cross stitcher. No offense to any of you who love cross-stitching, but I probably will do pickleball. And then I also have spend more time as a family, and what we're going to do is we're going to do Sunday game nights every week with my kids. Sunday night, everybody's going to get to pick a game, either a board game or a Switch game that they want to play, and we are going to start having Sunday game nights. And then the last one that I'll share is I want to be on my phone less. Don't we all? Our phones take over our lives. But this year, I'm really going to try to be on my phone less, be more present. I know everybody says that. But anyways, I would love to know what you guys' New Year's resolutions are. So if you want to go to my Instagram, it's She Investigates Pod, all one word. And let me know on the post for this episode what your New Year's resolutions are. That would be really fun for me. So if you feel like doing that, that would be great. And with that, let's get into today's case. It is a case that has baffled aviation experts, conspiracy theorists, and amateur sleuths for decades. In August 1942, during the height of World War II, a U.S. Navy blimp embarked on a routine patrol off the coast of California. Hours later, the blimp crashed into a suburban neighborhood. The mystery? Its 2-man crew had vanished without a trace. What happened to the crew of the Ghost Blimp? Let's uncover the details of this airborne mystery. It was August 16th, 1942, and World War II was raging across the globe. And here on the home front in the good old US of A, the United States was high on alert. And the Navy was actually conducting regular patrols along the Pacific coastline. And that was to guard against possible enemy submarines. So on this morning, the U.S. Navy L-8 blimp lifted off from Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. Its mission was pretty straightforward. It was just a routine anti-submarine patrol. Now, when you hear the word blimp, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is the Goodyear blimp. And it actually is true that these blimps were used by Goodyear to advertise their tires. And then during the war, the Navy took over a small fleet of the Goodyear blimps to do these anti-submarine patrols. The reason why they liked using these blimps was because they were able to stay airborne for a long time and survey the ocean below. Unlike the rigid airships with the metal frames and everything, the blimps were really simple. They just had a gas-filled balloon called an envelope with a control car or a gondola attached underneath. So the blimps would scout out Japanese subs on the west coast, and on the east coast, they would be looking for German U-boats. Also, something that they loved about the blimps is that because of how simple they were, they could be operated by really small crews. And they could even stay aloft and float along crewless, which will be demonstrated in this story. The blimp was manned by two experienced crew members, and they were Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody. He was a 27-year-old pilot, and Ensign Charles Adams, a 35-year-old co-pilot. Both of the men were really highly skilled, and they were well regarded by their peers. They were some of the best that the Navy had to offer. They were both experienced airship pilots, and Cody had actually graduated from the Naval Academy in 1938. Adams had been in the Navy for over a decade and was recently commissioned as an officer. So I just wanted to point out that these were not inexperienced pilots. They knew what they were doing. They had a lot of experience under their belts, and they were some of the best that the military had to offer at this point in time. There was a third man that was going to be on the blimp with them, and that was a machinist named James Riley Hill. And he briefly actually got on the blimp, but Lieutenant Cody actually was worried about the weight that it added having this third person on board of the blimp, and so he got off the blimp before it even took off. The weather was clear. The flight was expected to be uneventful. It took off at 6:03 a.m., and like I mentioned, it took off from Treasure Island, and by all accounts, everything was going as planned. Really, nothing eventful was happening. That is until 7:38 a.m., and that is when the crew radioed that they had spotted an oil slick in the water. Now, an oil slick was a potential sign of enemy submarine activity. So they radioed in, and the message that they sent said, "Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by." And this was the last communication ever received from Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams. The waters off of San Francisco that day were busy. There was lots of fishing boats, as well as Navy and Coast Guard ships. So there was lots of people that were watching this blimp up in the sky and watching its movements. Some people reported seeing the blimp drop some smoke flares, and this was something that they commonly would do to mark the spot where they had located an oil slick. Others on the water that day reported seeing the blimp descend toward the water as if it was investigating the oil slick before climbing back up into the sky. And after that, hours of radio silence. Eventually, the blimp failed to return to base, and the Navy started to get kind of worried, and so they decided to send out a search for the blimp. The next spotting of the blimp was at 10:49 a.m. by a Pan Am Clipper pilot. The pilot reported seeing the blimp over the Golden Gate Bridge. A search plane also spotted it at 2,000 feet, which is twice as high as it normally flew. At 2,000 feet, they were getting very close to where the blimp capped out and wasn't able to function anymore. But after it reached that 2,000 feet limit, it dropped back below the clouds again. The next to see the blimp was onlookers at a local golf course. After passing the golf course, it made a descent and it looked like it was going to crash into a local beach. And there was people on this beach. A couple of the beachgoers even tried to grab the ropes that were hanging from the blimp and guide it down, but they were overpowered by the weight of this blimp. One of the depth charges broke free off the side of the blimp, and once that weight was gone, the blimp took flight again and soared back up into the sky. At 11:15 a.m., the blimp was spotted drifting over the coastline near Daly City, just south of San Francisco. Witnesses described it as descending erratically before it crashed into a neighborhood. It scraped roof lines, and it even took down power lines with it, dragged power lines behind it. Now, miraculously, nobody on the ground was injured, but when the rescuers reached the blimp, they started working furiously to try to rescue these pilots. But when they got to the gondola, it was empty. There was no passengers. Cody and Adams had vanished without a trace. Upon finding the gondola empty, they figured maybe they were underneath this big, huge billow of fabric that made up the envelope part of the blimp. So they started cutting into it, and still, nothing, no one. The Navy conducted a very thorough examination of L8, and they even confiscated photos that were taken by onlookers that day. There was a lot of people that were taking pictures of this blimp that was crashing into a residential neighborhood. That's not something that you see every day. So this was a big deal for the people in that area, and they were snapping pictures like crazy. The Navy confiscated all of those pictures and started taking statements from witnesses. And let me tell you, these witness statements are all over the place. Some people claimed that they saw someone manning the blimp. Some claimed they saw as many as 3 people in the gondola. And one eyewitness even claimed to have seen someone parachute from the blimp. Now, this statement would later be proven impossible because both of the men's parachutes were still in the blimp when it crashed. The Navy studied the photos as well as the blimp, and really, none of their questions were answered. If anything, the mystery only deepened. The first thing that they found is that the cockpit door was open, but there was no sign of a struggle or any damage indicating foul play. Also, like I mentioned just barely, both of the parachutes were still on board, as well as the lifeboat and all of the emergency equipment. You would think if you had to leave the blimp in a hurry, that those were things that you would take with you. You would want parachutes, you would want your lifeboat. Those are things that you wouldn't leave behind. The life jackets that were on the blimp were gone, but this was to be expected, and that's because at the time it was protocol to wear them at all times while the blimp was airborne. So they would have had the life jackets on even if they had smooth sailing, no problems with the blimp at all. The radio was fully functional. There were no distress calls sent, but they could have sent a distress call at any time because there was absolutely nothing wrong with the radio. Personal items belonging to Cody and Adams were undisturbed, and there was also no evidence of the blimp being shot at or burned. Even stranger, the blimp itself appeared to be completely intact. There was nothing wrong with this blimp. No emergency situation. The gas valves were operational. The engines were still in working order. The only thing that was a little bit weird was there was a slight tear in one of the blimp's envelopes, but that was likely caused, honestly, during this crash. Now, prior to this particular flight, the L8 blimp had made 1,092 flights without incident. And I say that just because I want you guys to realize that this was not something that was happening frequently with the blimps. Like, this blimp had made multiple missions with no accident at all. And that's what made this so bizarre and why people were taking pictures, because this was not something that you were seeing all the time during this time period. At first, the suspicion was that the men had survived, and they thought that they possibly maybe had even been picked up by another boat or were hiking back to headquarters. This does not really make sense to me, because if they were picked up by another boat, don't you think that that boat would have radioed to somebody that they had picked up these military pilots and were taking them back to headquarters? Eventually, after a very thorough investigation spanning days and encompassing both the land and the sea, and no sudden reappearance of the pilots, an official inquest into the matter was called by the Navy. With no real solid leads to go on, and all of these differing eyewitness accounts, the matter eventually just had to be closed with no real answers, and both of the pilots were actually declared legally dead. Over the years, there has been numerous theories that have emerged to try to explain the disappearance of the Ghost Blimp's crew. So I want to talk about a couple of those theories today. The first is that Cody or Adams, one or both of them, accidentally fell out of the blimp. Some people believe that Cody and Adams may have leaned out of the cockpit to investigate that oil slick and that they fell overboard. That explains why all of the communications stopped after they radioed in that they were investigating. Something that was strange about the message that they radioed in is that at the end they said, "Stand by," which would indicate that they were going to report back after they'd had a chance to investigate this oil slick. But we know that after they radioed in that message, it was radio silent. We never heard from them again. The Navy made it clear also that they did not have a lot of confidence in the actual latch of the blimp door, and that it's possible that it accidentally opened. Are you kidding me? Isn't that something that you would like to know before you go up into a blimp hundreds of feet off the ground? That we don't really know if this door is secure. It might be, it might not. Is that just me? Or would you want to know that before you got on this thing? One would think that if that's what happened and one of these pilots fell overboard, that the other one would radio for backup rather than jumping in after him to save him. But then again, none of us really know what our instincts would be in that situation, and maybe the other pilot instinctively tried to grab his fallen co-pilot, resulting in them then both falling. The reason why this theory doesn't really make sense to me is that there were so many other boats and people on the shore that day that were looking directly at the blimp, especially as it lowered to investigate this oil slick. Yet no eyewitnesses ever reported seeing someone fall out of the blimp. It is possible, I talked about the flares that people saw that they dropped. Is it possible that they were dropping flares into the water to mark the spot where somebody had fallen rather than where the oil slick was? Sighting of the blimp after it rose above the oil slick and took off suggested that the blimp was still manned at that point and didn't seem out of control. But part of me thinks that this might be kind of hard to deduce. I mean, it's a giant floating balloon, not an airplane or a helicopter, which would be easy to identify as unmanned. The only other evidence that the blimp was still manned came from an eyewitness that observed the blimp when it flew over the golf course. And this was a 17-year-old boy who claimed he looked up at the blimp with binoculars and could see figures in the cabin. The next theory that I want to talk about is that there was some type of enemy action taken. This theory suggests that the blimp encountered an enemy submarine or aircraft. I mean, let's be real. They were investigating a very real threat of Japanese submarine activity. And let's not forget, we were in the middle of a literal war. But with no signs of a struggle or external damage to the blimp, I kind of think that this theory is unlikely. Not to mention how busy the water was that day. All of the eyes were trained on the blimp as it descended to inspect the oil slick. And from the fishermen to the patrol boats, I feel like somebody would have had to have seen something if this was the answer. There was one boat in particular, a cargo ship, that was named Albert Gallatin, and it was right near the blimp. And one of the passengers, Wesley Frank Lamoureux, told the inquest board, "We figured by that time that it was a submarine. From then on, I am not too positive of the actions of the dirigible, except that it would come down very close over the water. In fact, it seemed to almost sit on top of the water." Now, it's true that after the blimp lowered to investigate the oil slick, boats in the area left really quickly. And that's because they assumed that there was a submarine, and they were worried that the blimp was going to drop a depth charge. What the heck is a depth charge? If you're like me and you had no idea what that was, I mentioned this term earlier when I was describing a piece of equipment that broke off the blimp when it grazed the beach, but I had never heard of it before. So if you're like me, I had to look it up. And it said, a depth charge is an explosive weapon used to destroy submarines and other underwater targets by detonating in the water near them. Depth charges are also known as depth bombs. So the other boats in the area, assuming that the blimp was investigating an enemy submarine, also probably assumed that they were going to be taking action and they didn't want to stick around in case that was true. And I don't blame them. If we're setting off water bombs, I don't want to be around. If they were taken by foreign enemies, it's more than possible that they were never seen again. The Japanese took more than 25,000 prisoners of war, and 72,000 Americans are still missing today across all theaters of combat in World War II. The next theory is that Cody and Adams disappeared deliberately. Is it possible that they staged their own vanishings? And if that's the case, what was their motive? This is kind of an intriguing theory, but there really isn't that much evidence to suggest that they had motives to desert their posts. They were both well respected within the military, and they really showed no signs of making plans to defect. Now, as with most deep mysteries, some people have turned to the paranormal for answers. Were the men abducted by UFOs? Whisked away by a dimensional anomaly? While this is far-fetched, these ideas persisted in the public imagination. And I personally am a very large follower of alien sightings and abductions. And while I think that this theory is entertaining to think about, this particular disappearance doesn't really bear any of the telltale signs of interaction with the paranormal that's shown in multiple other cases. I think that it's highly unlikely, but the thing with this case is that people were just so desperate for an explanation that they kind of just started grasping at any theory that they could think of, like defecting or UFOs, even if they had little to no evidence behind them. So I think that's where this particular theory came from, is people just wanting so bad for there to be an explanation to these disappearances. There's one last theory that I want to talk about, and that is a theory that was presented by an internet sleuth. His name was Otto Gross, and he has an interesting theory. He claims that he got access, somehow, to the Department of Defense's records on the L-8. And he thinks that the L-8 was testing experimental radar equipment. Now, I didn't mention this before, but one of the items that was retrieved from the crash was a briefcase. And that briefcase contained classified documents. Nobody really knows what was in these documents, but Otto Gross claims that he's gotten access to them and that they contained records of radar testing. According to a few eyewitnesses to the crash, the briefcase was taken from the crash scene by a, quote, mysterious government man, but that he never came to the inquest when the investigation into the crash took place. Otto claims that this new radar was used to detect U-boats and that it used poorly shielded microwaves, which disoriented the crew, causing them to fall overboard. He says that the new radar equipment had recently been shipped to Point Reyes and Farallon Islands, which are both areas that are near the crash. He also claims that one of the blimp's pilots, Adams, had recently been transferred from the rangefinder division, which specialized in radar testing. So I guess it makes sense that if they spotted an oil slick and they really were in possession of this new radar equipment, that they would want to test it out. So did the microwaves bounce around the cabin, causing one or both of them to fall overboard? I guess we'll never know. I found all of this information on a blog that was written by Otto Gross, and it was kind of hard to find out like what his actual credentials were and how he supposedly got all of this information. It seems to me that his blog has actually like long since been abandoned, and I took a chance and I sent off an email to the email address that was on his blog asking if he had any interest in talking about this theory that he has. But the email came right back to me. So I think that the email is no longer in use. And the last time that anybody has written on the blog was in 2013. But I did link to the blog in my show notes if you want to take a look at it for yourself. It looks like he claims that a lot of the supposed secret documents that he talked about getting were at one point uploaded to the blog, but now they're just big triangles with an exclamation point on them, and it says they can't load. So did the government man from the crash site catch wind of this blog and shut it down? I don't know. It's just a theory, but it is an interesting one. 8 years later, the Ghost Blimp remains one of aviation's most puzzling mysteries. The disappearance of Ernest, Cody, and Charles Adams really has no clear-cut explanations. It just leaves behind a trail of unanswered questions and a haunting legacy. Now, the blimp itself, the L-8, was repaired and actually returned to service for the rest of the war. Then, following the war, it was given back to Goodyear, and its control car eventually became part of the Goodyear Blimp America. It retired in 1982, and the control car went to the National Naval Aviation Museum, which is in Pensacola, Florida, and it's actually still on display there today. So if you wanted to go see it, take a little trip to Pensacola, Florida. The Ghost Blimp's eerie story continues to captivate and confound. For the families of the missing men, the lack of closure is a lingering wound. For historians and mystery enthusiasts like myself, the Ghost Blimp serves as a reminder of how even the most routine missions can take an inexplainable turn. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of She Investigates. The Ghost Blimp is a story that floats between reality and mystery, leaving us to wonder what truly happened on that fateful date in 1942. If you have any theories or insights, reach out to us. We would love to hear from you on our social media. Our Instagram handle is @SheInvestigatesPod, all one word. You can find us on Facebook by searching She Investigates Podcast, and we are also on TikTok @She Investigates Podcast. Next week, we'll dive into the murder of Mackenzie Lewick. Until then, I'll be snooping so you don't have to. This is She Investigates, signing off.